It was supposed to be the safest money in America. Not a get-rich-quick scheme, not a risky Wall Street bet, not someone's cryptocurrency dream. This was pension money, the retirement savings of teachers, firefighters, sanitation workers, and city clerks who had spent decades doing the unglamorous work that holds a civilization together. People who showed up before sunrise and clocked out long after dark. People who worked until their knees gave out on tile floors and their backs finally quit on loading docks. People who were told, from the very first day they signed their employment papers, that the money would be there when they needed it most. It wasn't. Between 1999 and 2003, inside the retirement system of Bridgehaven County, a mid-sized industrial county in the American Midwest, a small group of administrators, investment consultants, and politically connected brokers quietly orchestrated one of the most audacious pension fund frauds in the region's history. They didn't do it with guns. They didn't break down a single door. They did it with spreadsheets, offshore shell companies, fabricated investment returns, and the unshakable confidence that nobody was watching closely enough to stop them. By the time the scheme collapsed, over $47 million in pension assets had been diverted, redirected, or simply made to disappear. 234 retirees would see their monthly checks slashed. A dozen families would lose their homes. And the men at the center of it, men who attended church on Sundays, coached Little League in the summers, and shook hands at county fairs with the very workers they were robbing, would spend years in courtrooms trying to explain how the money meant for the elderly had vanished into the accounts of the well-connected. This is the story of how it happened, and why, in a system built entirely on trust, the fraud was almost shockingly easy to pull off. Before we go any further, if you want more stories like this, real financial crime with real consequences and real people behind it, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we go deeper into the cases the mainstream press moved past too quickly. Now let's get into it. To understand the fraud, you first have to understand the machine. The Bridgehaven County Employees Retirement System, known locally as BCERS, had been established in 1961. It was a defined benefit pension plan, meaning employees were promised a specific monthly payment in retirement regardless of how the markets performed. The county contributed. The workers contributed. A board of trustees oversaw everything, and the pooled money was invested to grow over decades so that when the promises came due, the fund could actually keep them. On paper, the structure was sound. In practice, by the late 1990s, it had become dangerously hollow from the inside. The Board of Trustees was composed almost entirely of political appointees, county commissioners, union representatives, and elected officials who rotated in and out on 2-year terms. Few had meaningful backgrounds in finance. Most relied completely on outside investment consultants to tell them where the money was going and whether it was growing. The external auditing firm, a regional accounting house called Delaware and Marsh, had held the BCERS contract for 11 consecutive years. The relationship had grown comfortable, too comfortable. Then, in early 1999, the county hired a new pension fund administrator, a man named Gerald Foust. Foust was 51 years old, silver-haired, and polished in the way that inspires premature trust. His resume looked impressive until you looked closely. A string of short tenures at mid-level municipal finance offices, a consulting business that had generated little verifiable revenue, a network of financial industry contacts that nobody on the hiring committee thought to independently verify. He was charming at the interview. He was confident in a way that read as competence. And he understood, with the precision of someone who had been studying this kind of institution for years, exactly where the holes were in the Bridgehaven system. He had 4 years to work with. He didn't waste a single one. Within 6 months of joining BC, Foust had done 2 things that would define the entire fraud. First, he consolidated control over information. Using a reorganization proposal he framed as an efficiency upgrade, Foust positioned himself as the sole liaison between the pension board and all outside investment managers. Board members, most of whom found investment committee meetings tedious and impenetrable, were relieved to delegate. They were still receiving quarterly reports. The numbers looked fine. Nobody asked hard questions about how those reports were generated or who verified them before they arrived. This was not an accident. This was architecture. Second, Foust introduced the board to a new investment advisory firm, a company called Meridian Capital Advisors, operated by a man named Thomas Price. Price worked out of a polished office in Indianapolis. Framed certificates lined the walls. The reception area had the quiet confidence of old money. But Meridian Capital Advisors had been second registered for less than 2 years. It had never managed pension assets of comparable size. No independent verification of its track record was requested. What Foust presented to the board was a glossy deck of investment returns, a portfolio performance summary assembled by Meridian itself. The board voted to allocate $18 million of BCERS retirement assets to Meridian Capital Advisors for what Foust described as alternative investment strategies. That decision, made in a county conference room over bad coffee on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2000, was the moment the fraud became operational. On screen, motion graphic money flows from the BCERS fund into Meridian Capital Advisors. A portion splits off. Arrows trace a path. Bridgehaven, 2 Delaware LLCs, Cayman Islands, account, personal accounts. The legitimate investment portion stays visible, but shrinks with each passing quarter. Here is where the story gets technical. Stay with it, because the mechanics are exactly what made this fraud survive for as long as it did. Meridian Capital did invest some of the BCERS funds, not all of it, and not wisely, but enough to generate real transaction activity that could be documented in quarterly reports. Price would place a portion of the allocated capital into actual positions, underperforming bond funds, a handful of real estate investment trusts, and record those transactions in the statements he sent back to Foust. What never appeared in those statements was where the rest of the money went. Approximately $31 million, moved in careful tranches across 22 months, was diverted through a layered web of intermediary transactions. Some of it flowed into 2 limited liability companies registered in Delaware shell entities with no employees, no operations, and names that sounded vaguely institutional. Some moved through a Cayman Islands account that investigators would later connect directly to Price's personal financial network. A portion circled back toward vendors and contractors with no legitimate role in pension fund management. Vendors that, when investigators finally traced the ownership structures, turned out to share beneficial connections with Foust himself. This is the classic 3-step layering scheme. The money enters the system as legitimate pension capital. It passes through enough legal structures, LLCs, offshore accounts, vendor payments, to look like ordinary investment activity. It exits the other side as untraceable personal wealth. Foust's job was to manage the information gap that made all of this invisible. The board received quarterly reports showing BCERS, alternative investments, performing in line with benchmarks, respectable returns, presented with enough technical language to seem credible and enough opacity to suppress follow-up questions. The external auditors at Delaware and Marsh were never given direct access to Meridian Capital's underlying account statements. They were given summaries. Summaries prepared, reviewed, and delivered by Gerald Foust's office. For 2 years, the scheme ran without a single serious challenge. By mid-2002, the edges were beginning to fray. The first warning came from inside the pension office itself. A junior accountant named Sandra, 26 years old, 2 years into her career, methodical in the way that only people who genuinely love numbers tend to be, had been assigned to reconcile quarterly data between the BCERS internal ledger and the Meridian Capital reports. She found a gap, not a dramatic one, a $340,000 discrepancy in a single quarter that refused to reconcile no matter how she approached it. She checked her formulas. She ran the figures again. She spent a weekend on it. The gap remained. She brought it to Foust on a Monday morning. He was calm. He was patient. He told her it was a timing difference, a routine accounting artifact common in alternative investment structures. He used enough technical language that who trusted the seniority of the man across the desk from her, began to second-guess her own work. She apologized for taking up his time. She went back to her desk. But something had shifted. After that meeting, Foust began stopping by her workspace more often than before, asking what she was working on, making casual conversation that never quite felt casual. There was nothing she could point to specifically, no threat, no explicit pressure, but she felt watched. She felt like the walls of the office had developed a kind of attention. She did not escalate, but she kept the note she had written about the $340,000 discrepancy. She filed it in a folder she kept at home. That folder would become critical evidence 18 months later. The second warning came from a different direction. A board trustee named Harold Briggs, a retired firefighters union representative whose own pension had been rolled into BCERS during a union merger, had started attending investment committee meetings more regularly. Briggs was not a finance professional, but he was stubborn, and something about Meridian Capital's quarterly reports had started to bother him in a way he couldn't fully articulate. The returns were too steady. Quarter after quarter, the alternative investment portfolio reported gains that barely varied. Real markets don't behave that way. Bull markets produce surges, recessions produce losses. The space between those extremes is where honest investing lives. But Meridian Capital seemed to have discovered a portfolio that existed entirely outside the laws of economic gravity. Briggs raised the concern at a board meeting in September 2002. He was told by Foust that alternative investments, by their structural design, were built to deliver stable, non-correlated returns. Technically, this was not an insane claim. Applied to this situation, it was a complete fabrication, delivered with total composure. The board voted to move on to other business. Briggs was the only dissenting voice. He left that meeting and made a phone call to a contact at the State Pension Oversight Office. That call would sit in a queue for 4 months before any action was taken. In those 4 months, Foust moved another $4.2 million. On screen. Timeline graphic January 2003. A single investigator's name appears. Carol Stanton, State Pension Oversight Division. In January 2003, a state investigator named Carol Stanton arrived at BCERS to conduct what her assignment sheet described as a routine audit. The word routine is carrying a lot of weight there. The audit had been partially triggered by Briggs's inquiry, though Stanton arrived without any formal suspicion of fraud. She was simply going to look at the books. She was methodical in the way that unravels everything. Within 3 weeks, Stanton had identified the same $340,000 discrepancy Sandra Yee had flagged 18 months earlier. She requested direct access to Meridian Capital's underlying account statements. Foust told her the documents were being compiled. She waited a week and asked again. More delays. She escalated to her supervisor. Her supervisor contacted the State Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division. In March 2003, federal investigators from the FBI and the Department of Labor's Employee Benefits Security Administration arrived in Bridgehaven County. The subpoenas came next. Bank records from Delaware, wire transfer logs from the Cayman Islands account, vendor payment, histories, corporate filings for both shell LLCs. The full picture assembled itself with terrible clarity over a period of 6 weeks. The investment returns reported to the board had been fabricated, constructed each quarter by price, and forwarded to Foust, who presented them as externally verified. The underlying investment accounts had been systematically drained. The Cayman Islands account contained approximately $9 million that had never been deployed into any legitimate investment vehicle. It had simply been sitting there, accumulating, waiting. On the morning of April 17, 2003, federal agents drove to a colonial-style home in the lakeside suburb of Harlan's Mill, a house with a 3-car garage, professionally landscaped grounds, and a market value of $1.4 million, a home paid for, dollar by dollar, with money taken from the retirement accounts of sanitation workers and school secretaries and men who had spent their careers breathing smoke. Gerald Foust answered the door in a bathrobe. The April morning was cold and overcast, the sky the particular grey of a Midwestern spring that hasn't committed yet. He looked at the badges and the paperwork, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Investigators later noted that his expression wasn't panic. It was something closer to relief, as though the years of managing the information gap had been, in their own way, exhausting. He was handcuffed on the front steps. Thomas Price was taken into custody in Indianapolis the same morning. The federal prosecution ran through 2004 and into 2005. Financial crimes cases always carry complexity. The defense teams worked hard on the technical ambiguity of alternative investment structures, but the reconstructed account records left almost no room to maneuver. Foust was convicted on 11 counts, including wire fraud, embezzlement from an employee benefit plan, and conspiracy. 14 years in federal prison. Price received 12 years plus full restitution orders that would consume virtually every asset he had accumulated across the period of the scheme. 3 others were convicted on lesser charges. 2 accountants who had processed Shell LLC transfers, and 1 Delaware and Marsh auditor who investigators determined had knowingly accepted Foust's summaries without performing independent verification in exchange for guaranteed contract renewals. Their sentences ranged from 18 months to 4 years. Sandra testified for the prosecution for 2 days. The folder she had kept at home, the note about the $340,000 discrepancy, helped establish the timeline of the fraud with a precision that the defense could not undermine. She received formal recognition from the Department of Labor for her role in the case. Harold Briggs sat in the front row of the courtroom for both verdicts. He did not celebrate when the guilty findings were read. He just nodded slowly, the way people nod when something they already knew has finally been confirmed. As for the retirees, the recovery was partial and painful. A federal restitution fund, combined with emergency county appropriations and a negotiated settlement with Delaware and Marsh, restored approximately 62 cents of every stolen dollar. For people living on fixed incomes in their 60s and 70s, that math was devastating. Several filed civil suits. Most settled for amounts well below what had been taken. A few never recovered, financially. The Bridgehaven pension fraud did not happen because the system was impossibly complex or the criminals were uniquely brilliant. It happened because of 3 conditions that appear in financial crime cases with near-perfect regularity. Concentrated information control. Foust worked deliberately to become the single point of contact between the board and all external managers. When one person controls what information flows upward, fraud disappears into the gap between what is happening and what is reported. Captured oversight. Delaware and Marsh had audited BCERS for 11 years. Long-term relationships between oversight bodies and the entities they audit breed a familiarity that quietly corrodes vigilance. The auditor, who eventually pleaded guilty, testified that he had felt awkward raising concerns because of his personal comfort with Foust. That awkwardness cost retirees millions. And complexity weaponized as a smokescreen. Price and Foust used the technical language of alternative investments to discourage scrutiny. Board members who didn't understand a presentation were given a more technical presentation. Confusion was not a side effect of the scheme. It was a core feature. These patterns did not end with Bridgehaven County. They appear in pension fraud cases from California to New York, from small municipal systems to massive state-level funds. The names change. The mechanics repeat. Before we close, let's be direct about something. In the world of financial crime, elderly people are not targeted because they are weak. They are targeted because they possess exactly what fraudsters want: decades of accumulated, liquidated savings, a lifetime of work sitting in one place. And the Bridgehaven case teaches 4 lessons that every retiree and every family member of a retiree needs to hear. Never rely on a single individual for financial updates. Foust controlled everything the board saw. The board never asked for original third-party statements directly from the bank or brokerage. They accepted summaries he prepared himself. If anyone managing your retirement money is the only one who can explain where it is and how it's performing, that is not a service arrangement. That is a vulnerability. Always request original statements from the custodial institution directly. Be deeply skeptical of complexity. Price and Foust used alternative investments as their vehicle, precisely because these instruments are harder to track. If an investment strategy cannot be explained to you in 3 plain sentences, do not put your money into it. Legitimate professionals can always simplify. Fraudsters need you confused. Treat consistent returns as a warning sign, not a reassurance. Harold Briggs noticed it and was voted down. Real markets fluctuate. A portfolio that returns the same steady number quarter after quarter, year after year, regardless of whether the economy is expanding or contracting, is not evidence of genius. It is evidence that the numbers are being managed or manufactured. Volatility is a sign of a transparent, functioning market. Perfect consistency is often a sign that someone is controlling what you see rather than what exists. And finally, pay attention when administrative changes happen. Most pension frauds accelerate after a new consultant is brought in or a new investment philosophy is announced. These transitions create information gaps that fraudsters exploit deliberately. If your pension provider announces a major shift in leadership or investment approach, that is your signal to read the fine print, attend the next public meeting, and ask direct questions in writing about who now has access to your funds. Gerald Foust served 9 years of his 14-year sentence before release on supervised parole. Thomas Price served 8. Neither has spoken publicly about the case. The Bridgehaven County Employees Retirement System was rebuilt from the ground up after 2003. New governance protocols mandated third-party verification of all investment returns. A prohibition was placed on any single administrator serving as the exclusive liaison to outside managers. Direct custodial access was written into every new investment management contract as a non-negotiable condition. The county board now meets monthly. An independent investment committee of credentialed professionals reviews external manager performance every quarter. When the new framework was proposed, some board members pushed back. The changes were expensive, they said. They added friction. They slowed things down. Harold Briggs, who served on the oversight committee that designed every one of those reforms, answered the same way every single time someone complained. You want to know what excessive looks like? Go talk to the people whose checks got cut. This story raises questions that go beyond Bridgehaven County, and we genuinely want to hear what you think. Who carries the most moral weight in this story? Foust for designing the fraud, Price for executing it, or the board members and auditors who failed to act on the warning signs? Make your case in the comments. Sandra Yee found the discrepancy 18 months before investigators arrived, but she didn't escalate after Foust dismissed her. She said she felt watched after that conversation. Have you ever noticed something wrong at work and second-guessed yourself into silence? What would you do differently now? Harold Briggs raised his hand in a room full of people who disagreed with him, and he was voted down. What does it actually take to keep pushing when the room has moved on? And do you know someone in your life who reminds you of Briggs? The retirees recovered 62 cents on the dollar. Is that justice? Or did the system fail them twice, once when the fraud happened and again when the recovery fell short? Now that you know the warning signs, consistent returns, complexity as a shield, one person controlling all information, do you feel confident you could recognize this pattern if it were happening in your own pension or retirement account? Tell us honestly in the comments. Drop your answer below. Share this with someone who needs to understand how pension fraud actually works. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. These stories deserve to be told, and told right.